This day started like so many others in our lives. All those morning rituals, laughter over a cup of coffee, a light kiss goodbye before work. Nothing unusual. But that day, seemingly the most ordinary in our routine, my world turned upside down. Have you ever felt that something in your life seems off? Like some tiny detail in your perfect puzzle just doesn't fit? That's how it was with me. It was something almost imperceptible. The slightly different tone of her voice, a strange look I caught a few days ago, or even a scent of perfume that didn't quite seem hers. But at the time, I didn't pay much attention to it. I thought it was just my imagination, a trick of my mind, or maybe fatigue. And then there I was sitting in the kitchen that evening, scrolling through my phone when I saw it. One detail, one hint, one thing that changed everything. It was something small, but trust me, it's often the small things that open our eyes to the biggest secrets. At first, I didn't want to believe it. It's just a coincidence, I told myself. But the more I looked, the deeper I fell into this rabbit hole. All those moments I'd brushed off as work stress or simple fatigue suddenly took on a whole new meaning. I stared at the phone, realizing this was a sign. This was the moment when you start to understand that everything you believed in might have been a lie. And then the questions flood your mind. How long has this been going on? What did I miss? And worst of all, who else knew? Have you ever had that feeling like the ground beneath your feet is beginning to crack? That's how it felt. I looked at my wife that evening as she smiled as usual and talked about random things. And I thought, God, can I even trust her? Who is she really? I couldn't take my eyes off her. Her smile, her movements, even the way she poured herself a glass of wine suddenly seemed so suspicious. Like she wasn't my wife, but someone entirely different wearing a mask. That evening, I made a decision. If something was truly happening, I had to find out, but not by confronting her. No, I wanted her to tell me everything herself, without pressure, without force. Just confess. And believe me, I was willing to do whatever it took to make that happen. What was it? What did I find? And what happened next? This is a story you simply have to hear to the end, because it was on that evening I realized that love, trust, and truth are three things that can instantly shatter your life if you're not ready for the truth. I always believed I knew my wife better than anyone else. We'd spent so many years together, and I thought there was nothing that could escape my attention. But lately, something began to change. It wasn't anything obvious, but small things that gradually made me feel like I no longer recognized the person sitting across from me at the table. It started small. Her phone, which used to rest peacefully on the nightstand or kitchen table, suddenly became her constant companion. She started taking it everywhere. To the kitchen, the bathroom, even out to take out the trash. I joked, "What? Are you afraid someone will read your recipes?" She laughed, but it wasn't the laugh I was used to. It was nervous, forced. She used to love talking about her friends, their plans, or interesting meetups. But now, when I'd ask, "How was your day?" her answers became short and vague. It was fine, nothing much, just chatted. I started noticing that her calendar was filling up with new meetings, mostly with friends I'd never heard of. She began staying late after work, explaining it was to help out a colleague. It made sense, kind of, but something about these excuses felt off. My intuition started sounding alarms. I tried to be rational. Maybe I'm just overreacting. Maybe she really is busy or has more on her plate than I think. But this feeling, this tiny seed of doubt, kept growing. And the more I convinced myself everything was fine, the more I noticed the same little things that made me uneasy. One evening, I decided to cook dinner for the two of us. It was my way of saying, "Hey, I see you're overwhelmed. Relax, I'll take care of everything." She was grateful, but again, her smile seemed so foreign. We sat down to eat, and I tried to start a conversation when her phone rang. She quickly grabbed it, not even glancing at me. I asked, "Who's that?" She replied, "Just work, nothing important." But what struck me was how quickly she silenced the call without answering. After that, she went to another room, saying she needed to rest. Something about it bothered me. What exactly? The number on her phone screen that I caught a glimpse of out of the corner of my eye. I didn't recognize it, but it wasn't the name of a colleague or friend I would have known. It was just a number with no saved name. And that was when all my internal alarms turned into full-blown suspicion. This scenario repeated several times. Call she ignored, but looked tense while doing so. Once, I even overheard her whispering something in the other room. Her voice was so quiet, but so filled with emotion that I couldn't ignore it. She stopped as soon as she saw me standing in the doorway. "What are you doing?" I asked. She answered too quickly. "I was just discussing something with a friend." But at that moment, I knew it was a lie. One day, coming home early, I saw her car parked on the other side of town near a cafe. She was sitting there with someone I didn't know. I couldn't go in and cause a scene, but that image was the last straw. I realized I couldn't ignore what was happening any longer. This is where my mission began. I decided to find out everything, but not tell her directly that I knew. I had to set things up so that she would confess everything herself. And this was only the beginning of the game I had chosen to win. After everything I had noticed, I realized that if I wanted to know the truth, I needed to act carefully and strategically. My emotions were screaming betrayal, but I knew that simple accusations could ruin everything if I was wrong. And I also understood, if she was really hiding something from me, she would do it very skillfully. So, I decided to play the long game. The first step was obvious. Her phone. It was the key to everything. But how could I access it? She carried it with her constantly. Before, when we trusted each other, her phone could rest peacefully on the nightstand or in the living room. Now it had become her companion, never left unattended. I decided to wait for the right moment. One evening, when she was in the shower, I quickly went into the bedroom. Her phone was lying on the bedside table. My heart was pounding like a thief's, even though this was my own home. I picked it up and started trying to unlock it, but there was a password, a new one I didn't know. Before, we had no secrets, and I knew her old password, but this one was different. I quickly put the phone back, hearing the water turn off. Over the next few days, I continued to observe. She became even more cautious, as if she sensed something. I decided that I needed a different approach. I started talking to her friends, trying to get any information. Once, I asked her closest friend how often they'd been meeting lately. Her friend, slightly surprised, replied that they hadn't seen each other in weeks. That was strange, considering my wife had told me they had spent time together just the day before. That's when I realized simple questions wouldn't get me anywhere. I decided to do something I would have never imagined before. I bought a small hidden camera. It felt radical, almost wrong, but I needed to know the truth. I installed it in the living room, near the bookshelf, so that it blended seamlessly with the surroundings. Reviewing the footage became my nightly ritual. I watched as she spoke on the phone, sometimes smiling, sometimes looking serious. Nothing concrete, but her behavior became increasingly concerning to me. One evening, as I was reviewing the footage, I saw her talking on the phone. Her voice was soft, but the words I heard made me freeze. "I miss you," she said. Those words hit me like a thunderbolt. Now I had evidence, but it wasn't enough. I wanted to know more before making any moves. However, my efforts almost failed. One evening, as she returned home earlier than expected, I was in the process of setting up another hidden camera. I heard the sound of her keys in the lock and quickly hid behind the couch, the camera still in my hands. She walked into the room and paused for a moment, as if sensing something. I sat there, barely breathing, as she slowly walked into the bedroom. That was the moment I realized how dangerous this game had become. If she caught me, everything would be lost. But I couldn't stop. Everything I was doing, everything I was risking, was for one thing: the truth. and I was prepared to go further, no matter the cost. I was sure the truth was close. But what would she do to me when I found it? That was the question that wouldn't let me rest. It was an evening that seemed completely ordinary. She said she would be late at work, and I used the time to finally relax a bit. But deep inside, I couldn't find peace. My intuition screamed that something was wrong. I couldn't focus on the movie playing on the TV, couldn't even enjoy my favorite dinner. My entire mind was consumed with the question, what was she hiding? And then it happened. Her laptop. It sat on the table in the living room, as usual. Unlike her phone, which was her constant companion, the laptop seemed safe. I had never paid attention to it before. But now, sitting on the couch, I couldn't take my eyes off it. Could it hold even a piece of the truth I was so desperate to find? I approached the table, took a deep breath, and opened the lid. The screen lit up, and to my relief, no password was required. Her email was open. At first, I didn't see anything suspicious. A few emails from colleagues, store newsletters, purchase receipts. But as I dug deeper, I noticed a folder that stood out. It was labeled personal. My heart began to race. I opened the folder and found messages. They dated back several months. Her tone in these messages was completely different. Tender, flirtatious, sometimes even passionate. She called someone baby, wrote about how much she missed them, and planned meetings that were clearly neither work-related nor friendly. I felt my blood rushing to my face. It was like a punch to the gut. I scrolled through the messages, hoping that maybe this was some sort of misunderstanding, a joke, or a game. But it was all real. There were photos, selfies of them at a cafe, dinners at restaurants we had never been to together. In one photo, she sat at a table, holding a glass of wine, with the same smile I knew, but her eyes had a completely different sparkle. And next to her was a man I had never seen before. I sat there, staring at the screen, feeling something inside me break. Anger, pain, disappointment, betrayal. These weren't just emotions. It was a storm spiraling out of control. I clenched my fists, trying to keep myself together, though inside, everything was screaming. How could she do this? How long has this been going on? Why didn't I notice earlier? But after the wave of anger came something else. Cold calculation. I realized that just knowing the truth wasn't enough. I wanted her to confess everything herself. I wanted to see her lies come out of her mouth. Wanted to hear how she would explain what she had done. I wanted her to feel the same pain I was feeling at that moment. My decision was made. I closed the laptop and put it back in its place as if nothing had happened. My heart was still beating like a drum, but my mind was clear. I wasn't going to make a scene. No. I had to act carefully, intelligently, strategically. She wouldn't even suspect that I knew until I decided it was time to reveal it. This was the moment when everything changed. I was no longer just a man who suspected betrayal. I was a man with a plan, and that plan was perfect. I wouldn't let her destroy me. She would confess everything herself, and I would make her do it. After I found evidence of her infidelity, I had no doubts left. But simply confronting her with this evidence felt like too primitive an approach. She could deny it, come up with excuses, or try to convince me that it was all untrue or a coincidence. No, that would be too simple, and I wanted her to confess. I wanted to see her destroy the lie she had been building for so long. For that, I needed a clever plan, and I was ready to play the long game. I started with the simplest step. I changed my behavior. If I had been warm and caring before, I now became cold and distant. I stopped initiating conversations and answered her questions briefly and emotionlessly. For example, when she asked, "How was your day?" I would simply reply, "Fine," and add nothing more. She noticed immediately. Her caring tone turned into a concerned one. She started asking, "Are you okay? Did something happen?" But I kept my distance. The more I pretended that nothing was wrong, the more it troubled her. The next step was to drop hints that I knew more than she thought. One evening at dinner, I unexpectedly said, it's interesting how people can try so hard to hide the truth, but it always comes out in the end. She froze, her hand stopping midair as she lifted her wine glass to her lips. She quickly smiled, but it was a forced smile. "Oh, that's true," she replied, trying to change the subject. But I could see it got to her. My words lingered in her mind. I decided it was time to escalate. The next step had to be decisive. I planned a special evening for us. I booked a table at the restaurant where we used to dine when our relationship was just beginning. It was meant to look like a romantic gesture, an attempt to rekindle the spark. But in reality, it was just a clever way to create additional tension. She had to believe that I either knew nothing or was trying to come to terms with the distance between us. But this time, I was preparing a trap. Before we left for the restaurant, I deliberately left her alone at home for a few hours, supposedly because of work matters. In reality, I used this time to set up a hidden camera in our bedroom. The camera was well hidden, almost invisible. I placed it among the books on the shelf, aimed directly at the spot where she often talked on the phone. I knew that if everything went according to plan, she would reveal herself. At the restaurant, I made another move. During dinner, while we were calmly chatting, I suddenly said, "By the way, I found something interesting at home. We'll need to talk about it later." Her expression changed. I saw her eyes widen for a moment before she quickly composed herself and asked, "What exactly did you find?" But I just smiled mysteriously and replied, "Not now. Let's just enjoy the evening." I could see the tension growing in her with every passing minute. She checked her phone several times, thinking I wouldn't notice. She acted as though she was trying to appear relaxed, but I knew she was on edge inside. This was part of my game. I wanted her to tangle herself in her own web of lies, to let her nerves do some of the work for me. When we got home, I told her I was tired and would go to bed early, leaving her alone in the living room. I knew this was her moment. She would likely want to check in with her friend, thinking I had already fallen asleep. I took out my phone and activated the hidden camera via the app. My heart raced as I watched the screen. She sat on the bed, holding her phone. At first, she just scrolled through it, but after a few minutes, she started making a call. Her voice was quiet, but her words hit me like a knife. "I can't do this anymore. I think he knows something. He's acting strange. I'm starting to get nervous." This was the moment of truth. She had confirmed my suspicions herself. She was close to breaking. But I knew this wasn't the end. The next day, I had to take the final step to make her confess directly to me, face to face. And it would be unforgettable. My plan was nearly at its climax, but I knew the key moment had to be flawless. I decided it was time to move on to the next step, to create the perfect trap where she would confess her infidelity. But to do so, I had to make her feel calm and confident, as if I suspected nothing. Only then could I exploit her fears and nerves. This had to be truly dramatic. I decided to organize a romantic evening. It seemed like an ordinary idea, but in reality, it was a calculated move. I took care of every detail. I booked a table at the restaurant where we had our first date, bought her favorite flowers, and even planned our favorite songs to make everything seem perfect. The main goal was to create an atmosphere where she would feel comfortable, where she would think everything was under control. But behind this idyllic scene was a trap. That evening, I returned home with a large bouquet of roses. Her reaction was mixed. On one hand, she seemed genuinely surprised and even slightly touched, but in her eyes, I saw something else, a shadow of anxiety. She asked, "What's the occasion?" I smiled and replied, "No occasion. I just wanted to remind you how much I love you." She couldn't argue with that, but I noticed her smile was slightly strained. We got into the car and headed to the restaurant. Along the way, I deliberately kept the conversation light, telling jokes and reminiscing about happy moments from our past. I saw her gradually relax. She probably thought her suspicions were unfounded, that I didn't know anything. That was exactly what I wanted. When we arrived at the restaurant, everything was perfect. We were escorted to the best table, next to a large window with a stunning view of the city. Champagne was already waiting on the table. She looked impressed, even moved. "This is so beautiful," she said, and I nodded, replying, "You deserve it." But in my head, a different thought kept playing. Wait, this is just the beginning. We started dinner, and I kept the conversation going. I talked about our youth, our first trips together. I even brought up our little arguments, turning them into jokes. She laughed, and for a moment, it seemed like everything was perfect. But then I decided to make my move. During one of the toasts, I suddenly said, I've been thinking a lot about us lately, about how we've changed over the years. But it's interesting how much we can still not know about each other, isn't it? Her smile froze. She quickly put her glass down and asked, "What do you mean?" I looked her straight in the eyes and replied, "Oh, nothing specific. Just thoughts. Sometimes we can live with someone and not know them completely." I saw a flicker of nervousness in her eyes. I decided to push a little further. "For instance, have you ever wondered if I might know more than it seems?" She looked unsettled. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. I smiled and replied, "Oh, nothing. Just random musings. Don't worry about it." But I could see she was already starting to panic. Her hands were slightly tense, and she glanced at her phone a few times, which was lying next to her plate. She tried to change the subject, asking about work and plans for the weekend. But I had already planted the seed of doubt in her mind. She could no longer relax. I could see her thoughts racing. She was trying to figure out what I knew and how close I was to the truth. After dinner, as we drove home, I added the final touch. "By the way, tomorrow I'd like to talk to you about something. But let's not get into it now. I want this evening to stay special." Her face turned to stone, but she simply nodded. She wanted to ask what I meant, but she held back. I could see the fear and tension building inside her. When we got home, I told her I was tired and would go to bed early. She stayed in the living room, as if trying to gather her thoughts. But I knew this was her moment. She would definitely check her phone or contact her friend to warn him or seek support. And I was ready for it. Everything was going according to plan. The tension was at its peak, and I knew she could already sense the trap, but she still didn't realize how deeply she was caught in it. The next step was the final confrontation. This moment was to be the culmination of my entire game. I had prepared every detail, every step, to bring her closer to the truth. But this time, I wasn't leaving her any chance to escape. It was the moment when all the cards were to be laid on the table. The next morning, I acted as if everything was normal. I made coffee, smiled, and even kissed her on the cheek, just as we used to do in the best days of our relationship. She looked a bit confused, probably trying to figure out if my hints from the previous evening meant anything. Her behavior was nervous, her hands constantly fidgeting with the spoon or the cup, and her eyes avoided meeting mine. I could see the battle of fear and the attempt to appear natural within her. When we sat down for breakfast, I started a calm conversation. I talked about work, weekend plans, but suddenly I shifted my tone. I leaned back in my chair and, looking her straight in the eyes, calmly said, I think it's time we had a serious talk. About everything. About you. About me. And about Tom." Her reaction was exactly what I expected. Her face instantly turned pale. She froze like a deer caught in headlights. Her eyes met mine, and I saw shock, fear, and panic in them. "Who?" she finally asked, but her voice betrayed her, trembling. I maintained complete composure and continued. "Tom, you know who I'm talking about. And don't try to pretend you don't understand." She lowered her gaze, and I could see her trying to pull herself together to find any words. I, I don't know any Tom, she said, but her voice sounded uncertain. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, and calmly replied, "Let's not play games. I know more than you think. Do you want me to show you the evidence? Or would you prefer to tell me everything yourself?" Her hands began to tremble. She tried to say something, but the words stuck in her throat. I gave her a few seconds, calmly watching as she struggled to come up with an excuse. And then, finally, she began to speak. "It's not what you think. I was just meeting with a friend. It was completely innocent," she started, but her tone was overly defensive, and her eyes betrayed her true emotions. I didn't interrupt her. I just looked at her silent, letting her talk. She nervously rambled out a tangled story, which became less and less convincing with every word. Her voice fluctuated between loud and quiet, and I could see her becoming more and more entangled in her lies. When she fell silent, I quietly said, "Is that all? Is this your version? Because, I have another one, and I don't think you want me to tell it to you right now." She froze again. Her face reflected fear. I could see her realizing that she could no longer hide anything. This was the moment when she broke. Fine, I'll tell you everything," she finally said, her voice trembling. She began to tell me how it all started, how they met, how it spiraled out of control. I sat there listening, staying calm and cold, though inside me a fire was raging. Every word she spoke was like a blade cutting deeper into my heart. But I knew this was the only way. She herself confirmed everything I had suspected, shattering the illusion she had built over the years. When she finished, I looked at her and said, "Thank you for finally telling the truth. It's a shame it took so much time and so many lies to get here." Her eyes filled with tears. She started pleading for forgiveness, saying it was a mistake, that she never meant for it to happen. But I wasn't listening anymore. My whole world had turned upside down, but now I held the control in my hands. I had destroyed her web of lies and forced her to confess. And even though it was the worst truth I could have imagined, I felt relief. Because now I knew where I stood. Sitting across from her, I watched as all her carefully woven lies began to crumble. She could no longer maintain the facade. Her hands nervously played with the napkin. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, but there was none. She was trapped in the web she had spun, and now I held the key. Her voice trembled as she finally began to speak. "Fine, I'll tell you the truth, but please just listen to me." She took a deep breath, and I saw her shoulders slump as though she was surrendering. "It started accidentally," she began. Her words sounded unsure, but I forced myself to remain cold. "We met at work. At first, it was just conversations, and then it somehow escalated. I didn't plan for this, really. I don't even know how it got so far." Her eyes filled with tears, and she paused, trying to collect herself. I stayed silent. I didn't interrupt, didn't show any emotion. This was her moment, and I wanted her to tell me everything she had been trying to hide. The more she spoke, the deeper she sank into her own truth. I didn't know how to stop," she continued, almost in a whisper. "I was afraid you'd find out. I knew what I was doing was wrong, but—" Her voice broke, and she lowered her head. The silence that filled the room was deafening. She sat in front of me, broken and drained, her eyes full of remorse. I gave her a few seconds to grasp that she had just destroyed everything with her own words. Finally, I spoke. My voice was calm, almost cold. "You think I didn't know? You think I was just sitting here, blind to everything happening?" She snapped her head up, her eyes widening in shock. "I knew you were cheating on me," I continued. "I've known for a long time. I saw everything, the messages, the photos, your meetings. But I waited. I waited to see how far you'd go. I waited for you to tell me yourself." Her face was indescribable. It was a mixture of horror, shame, and disbelief. She opened her mouth, as if to say something, but no words came out. Her hands clenched the napkin so tightly it nearly tore. "I set this up," I said, leaning slightly forward. "I orchestrated everything so that you couldn't hide the truth anymore. And you know what? I succeeded. You just confessed to everything. You destroyed it all yourself." I paused, giving her time to process what had happened. Her tears started to flow, and she grabbed her head in her hands. I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You don't need to say anything," I replied. "Your actions have already said everything." Inside me, emotions were raging. On one hand, there was bitterness, the bitterness of betrayal from the woman I trusted. But at the same time, I felt a strange satisfaction. Her cunning didn't work. She thought she could hide everything, but I had outsmarted her. I stood up from the table and quietly said, "Now you know that I know. Now it's all up to me." Think about that. Her eyes were red from crying, and she couldn't say anything in return. I left the room, leaving her alone with her thoughts, her guilt, and her shattered illusions. This was the end of her game. But for me, it was just the beginning of a new story, a story where I would no longer allow myself to be deceived. After she confessed, I decided it was time to reveal everything to her. She needed to know that this wasn't just coincidence or carelessness on her part, but a carefully planned game in which I controlled every move. She thought she was manipulating the situation, but she didn't even realize that I had anticipated her every step. I walked back into the room where she still sat, clutching her head, her shoulders barely moving. She didn't hear me enter. When I quietly said, "I think it's time we talked honestly," she flinched and looked up. Her eyes were full of fear, and I could see her struggling to pull herself together. "Why did you do this? Why did you provoke me?" she asked, her voice quiet and broken. I slowly sat across from her, keeping a cold, expressionless face. "You want to know why?" I replied. "Because I couldn't live in a lie anymore. I saw you hiding behind your phone, coming up with excuses for your absences. Did you think I didn't notice? I saw everything. And you know what's the funniest part? I gave you a chance to confess, but you didn't take it." She looked at me in despair. "I was scared," she whispered. "I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want this to happen." Her voice trailed off, and I saw tears welling up in her eyes. "Didn't want this?" I raised an eyebrow. "Is that what you're saying now? You didn't want it, yet you kept lying to me for months? You didn't want it, yet you made time for someone else while I thought we were happy? That's your excuse." Her tears grew stronger, and she began to plead. "Please, just listen to me. It was a mistake. I was confused. I didn't know what to do. But it meant nothing to me. I love you, truly." Her voice broke, and she fell into a silent cry. I watched her with cold detachment. Every word she said sounded like a pathetic attempt to convince me of something I could no longer believe. "Love me?" I repeated with a bitter smile. "You love me. Yet that didn't stop you from crossing every line. You know what else? I've known about this for a long time. I saw it all, your messages, your calls, your meetings. And I gave you a chance to fix it. But you didn't take it." She looked stunned. "You knew all this time?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I nodded. "Yes, I knew everything, every detail. I saw the messages, heard your voice when you spoke to him, but I chose not to tell you. Do you know why? Because I wanted you to shatter this illusion yourself. And you just did, right now." Her tears flowed like a river as she grabbed my hand. "Please don't leave me. It was a mistake. I'll never do it again. Give me a chance to fix everything." Her voice was filled with despair, but I remained unmoved. "A chance," I repeated. "You want a chance? You already had one. You had every chance to be honest with me. But you chose lies. You chose betrayal." I slowly stood up. "Now, you'll have to live with the consequences of your choices." The tension in the room became almost unbearable. She sat on the floor, crying and pleading, but I could no longer feel anything for her except cold disappointment. Her cunning hadn't worked. Her excuses rang hollow, and her tears could no longer move me. I took a step toward the door and paused for a moment, looking back. You always thought you were smarter than everyone, that you could get away with everything. But you were wrong, and now you'll be left alone with your mistakes. I left, leaving her in the room filled with despair and the shadows of our former life. When the door closed behind me, I stopped in the hallway. My heart was pounding, my thoughts were swirling chaotically, and her words kept echoing in my head. It was a mistake. I love you. Give me a chance. All this time, I had felt strong, in control of the situation, but now, with everything laid bare, I felt the weight of reality. What now? Forgive? Or leave for good? I stood there, trying to find an answer to a question that had no simple solution. I understood that what had happened was more than just betrayal. It was the destruction of trust, the foundation of our relationship. Now I had to decide if I could live with what I knew or if this betrayal would forever stand between us like an invisible wall. I walked downstairs and stepped outside. The night was quiet, with only the occasional light breeze. I walked a few steps, inhaling the cold air, trying to calm the storm inside me. What does it mean to forgive? Does it mean to forget? Could I ever look at her without feeling the weight of what had happened? Could I ever trust her again? My mind told me it was impossible, but my heart, it still remembered the times when we were happy, when I believed she was the most important person in my life. But what if I chose to leave? That would mean starting over. An empty house, an empty bed, the absence of someone who, despite everything, had been a part of my life for so long. I wasn't afraid of being alone, but I was afraid of the emptiness she might leave behind. She had destroyed what we had built over the years. But did that mean I had to destroy everything completely? Was there any point in giving her a chance? Or would that just be a weakness I would hate myself for later? I looked up at the night sky. The stars seemed so far away, so indifferent to my pain. And suddenly I realized this decision would determine not just our future, but also who I would become. I returned to the house. She was still sitting on the floor in the living room, her face stained with tears. She looked up when I entered, and in her eyes, I saw hope, that I would say something to give her a chance. But I said nothing. I just looked at her, and in that silence, there was more than 1,000 words. I saw her despair, her fear, her regret. But was that enough? I stopped at the doorway to the room, cast one last glance at her, and said, never underestimate someone who loves you. Love can be the brightest feeling, but it can also become the sharpest weapon. I gave you my love, and you used it to hurt me. What happens next? That depends on both of us. I didn't say whether I would forgive her or leave her. I left her there, in that silence, where she had to understand that this wasn't just her mistake, but also her choice. You're probably wondering, what did I decide? Will I forgive her? Will I leave her? But I'll tell you only this. This was just the beginning. Sometimes we make decisions not immediately, but at the moment when our heart is ready for them. Now tell me, what would you have done in my place?